main priority is getting India up to speed, helping India build the infrastructure it needs, helping India build the relationships in international business that it needs, and just helping India. But then a point would come in 10 to 20 years, demographics have caught up with China, the Indian economy has really rampaged up. There would come a point where maybe we should work harder to rebuild relationships with China. Like, that's the kind of baseline Machiavellian stuff that we should be doing right now instead of figuring out how to genocide more brown people in Gaza.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I am Murray, in charge of podcasting, and in charge of politics is Robert. How are you this week?
Not bad, Rory. How you doing?
Not bad. Everything seems to be going all right. I just thought this week we'd maybe do like a small episode, maybe about Zoran Mamdani. It's only one guy. He's in New York. New York. It should be easy enough. What do you think?
Yeah, nice small,
not too much history involved.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a great idea. And Zoran Mamdani is a great topic. The U.S. election is great. Unfortunately, today, Rory, I was hoping we would go as kind of big picture as possible. I'm beginning to question
free buses. They're big.
Well, free buses are big. That's important and very useful to the folks here in New York City. I hope Mamdani gets elected. I think he's a real hopeful opportunity for the Democratic Party. And now that you mention it, perhaps we will cover Mamdani in a future episode, perhaps when the race has begun to heat up a bit more. But today I want to talk about China, India, and the nature of history.
Oh, okay. The nature of history, not just a lot of history.
Just a small smidgen of a thing here.
Okay.
And it's funny, I was thinking about this, and it's almost like in some ways I'm becoming a little bit more mainstream in my view of things, because this is certainly not going to be the first piece of media that any of the audience has consumed that asserts that China and India are a big deal. But I think I want to go even more extreme in that mainstream direction to say, actually, China and India are kind of the biggest story of the 20th century. I think most people would agree that China and India are likely to be the biggest story of the 21st century. But I think that in retrospect, 400 or 500 years from now, we'll look back at the 20th century, and I think China and India are likely to be the main story of the 20th century as well. And I think today I'd like to sort of put forward the rudiments of that narrative and talk about how it's sort of made it harder for me to finish my own historical projects and has put reading a whole bunch of other history in some new light for myself. So yeah, kind of big picture, Ray. I'm sorry to report that. We'll probably get to Mamdani in a future episode.
Okie dokie. So what is it about other countries you think will kind of just not really be considered or thought about when people look back at the 20th century?
So I'm currently writing a book on U.S. empire, and I've spent it has been months trying to reckon with the 1930s and the 1940s and the Great Depression and whatnot. But when I get to the 1940s and the way that most histories treat the 1940s, everybody wants to talk about World War II. Because World War II is fundamentally really interesting. There's compelling bad guys. There's cool new weapons systems that are used in horror.
There's nuclear bombs.
Yeah, horrifyingly and intriguingly destructive ways.
And it still feels like we're kind of in the post-World War II era. All of the countries are still kind of a bit have grown from that end point.
That's a really good point. It's exactly. We were everything about modern life, it seems like, both for the combatants and for people in the world at large, has been determined by World War II and this great conflict. And I got thinking a little bit about actually early Islamic history.
More golden ages.
Certainly there are points that people refer to as the golden age, but I'm sort of thinking about how if you were living in the Byzantine Empire or, what used to be the Byzantine Empire and the Persian empires that were part of the Arabic Empire, I kind of feel like in the 80 or so years after that, what you would have thought was important about your life or how you saw the history of the past century,
Hmm.
you'd be really, really concerned and would like want to talk about the great battles that took place between the Byzantines and the Persians, the Eastern Romans and the Persians in the 600s. And you would certainly be aware of, kind of in the back of your mind, like how this Muslim empire had taken advantage of that and had sort of taken over vast swaths of territory. But in the early Muslim empire, like they weren't even that interested in mass conversions, because with mass conversions, there's fewer people to tax or what have you. So it could be, at that point, it could be like, now from our perspective, 1500 years later, it's like obviously the most important thing that was happening in the 600s was Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad coming out of the desert and forming this massive empire that turned those lands Islamic down to the current day. Like
Hmm.
that's obviously the most important thing. But for people living, 80 to 100 years later, they probably would have been like, oh, but let's talk about the great battles of Heraclius versus the Sassanids and da 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 da. The way that we today are kind of like, oh, yeah, man, like the Battle of the Bulge, or wasn't it crazy? Like Iwo Jima, Okinawa. I don't know if these resonate as much in Europe, but these are huge, huge names, these World War II battles and this is specifically while working on the 1940s chapter, more generally, it's like actually like 500 years from now, nobody's going to really remember that the Japanese had an empire or that like, Hitler and the Nazis were a thing. But they probably will be aware in some footnote that it was actually the 1940s when both China and India regained their independence. That's kind of like an
Oh yeah,
important.
yeah, definitely. Because if you look at generally at most populations throughout world history, it's China and India, and then like rest of the world, and it's
Yeah, and
likely to go back that way.
well, and specifically, it's the economic production of most of the world. It seems like, and it varies, but it seems like, and please keep in mind that like GDP measurements
Oh,
are
very
always
off.
suspect, and that's when we're talking about GDP measurements for 2025. If we're talking about GDP measurements before anybody knew what gross domestic product meant, we're obviously making stuff up and fudging it. But generalized estimates are that like half of economic value up until like 1500 or so of the entire world was China and India. As recently as 1800, it was still like 30-40% was China and India. And
Hmm.
then in the 1850s, really in just an indicator of how dominant the British Empire was, in the space of 5 years, the British Empire conquered both China and India. Not typically the way that it's looked at, but I think that's actually a fair description of what the First War of Indian Independence in 1857, sort of trickling out into the latter 1850s, and the Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860. That's actually what happened, was the conquest of China and India, this sort of snuffing out of those two countries as serious components in economic power and political power in the world. And I think really the 1940s are that first blush of those countries to some extent unifying to an extent that they never had before. This is, I think, more popularly accepted to be the case with India, but also totally the case with China, simply because the capacity of any state to be more unified and more together in the technological, with the technological possibilities of the 1940s and the 1950s is infinitely higher than what it was in the 1840s or the 1850s.
Do you find it strange that India seemed to get its independence through peace, while China got its through bloody revolution on top of invasion?
Well, that's an interesting question, because there's been massive warfare in Indian history and in recent Indian history leading up to the independence in the 1940s. The Indians, of course, heavily participated in both World War I and World War II, supporting, at least supporting, I think, participating in trench warfare in World War I. Most of the combatants on the side of the British Empire in the Pacific theater of World War II were Indian soldiers. So this was sort of in the context of catastrophe. I think part of it is that China was never quite conquered to the same extent that
Yeah.
India was, which is an interesting dynamic, whereas the Chinese had to sort of constantly fight off a whole bunch of disparate actors that were never very invested in Chinese success. They still wanted to come in and crush it. Whereas for the British in India, they simply reached a point where they acknowledged they simply couldn't afford to hold on into India any
Well, I
longer.
also heard some arguments. Well, I was a British man, so maybe it was a pinch of salt. But he was basically like, "We'd got everything we wanted out of India. It was unprofitable, so they could have it back."
There's some truth to that, though. If Britain had maintained the financial position that it had had before World War One, for its choice to join World War One, I think its capacity to continue to leverage the economy of a subcontinent would have it would have continued, I think. But certainly, yeah, by they can put any swing they wanted on it, but by the 1940s, they simply could not afford it. And it is just interesting looking at the history of the 1940s from that light. It's sure, of course, in the context of our grandfathers fighting or all of the incredible World War II movies we've all grown up
Mhm.
consuming, it's very possible to focus on that when really, I think as we get more and more distance from it, maybe a century or two, it'll be the reemergence of China and India that's so important. I think it's just a brief note, like as I look forward into this book that I'm writing about U.S. empire, it's clear, becoming clearer and clearer to me that the Cold War was not really about competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. What it was really about was worldwide independence from European empire. That is actually the story of the 20th century, and that too is a story that will become clearer as we move further into this century and into the next century, and people are like, "It's just gonna be it really is gonna be like the Byzantines and the Persians fighting." It's like, that's not the important thing about the 20th century. The important thing is independence for everybody. I think a what is interesting and what makes China and India very different, and this line can be blurred, is that China and India very much become independent in the 1940s. Almost nobody else does.
Okay.
Like most of Africa, I think all of Africa
Mhm.
remains part of European empires until the 1960s and 1970s. Latin America, actually, through the Cold War, Latin America becomes subject to a nastier form of U.S. control than it had ever been subjected to. You can say the 1980s were, in fact, one of the worst decades in Latin American history. Certainly, unlike the 19 teens and the 1920s, it wasn't U.S. soldiers taking over countries the way that we had taken over Haiti, Nicaragua, Dominican Republic, Cuba, a whole bunch of other places in the teens and 20s. But it was a wave of U.S.-sponsored dictators across Latin America that like had really repressed that whole continent in ways that it's still recovering from. So it is the 1940s is a story of Chinese and Indian independence. It's an open question to what extent anybody other than China and India has become independent in the decades since. I mean, honestly, you can look at the 2020s as a revelation of the degree to which Europe isn't really independent or sovereign or separate from the United States. So I think that's a sort of reframing of the way that we think about World War II and the Cold War in the United States that I think is very worth doing and is something I've been thinking about a lot
But are
recently.
you confident that China and India will be like a going concern in, say, 100 years? Is it possible they may break up and be, two, three, four of separate countries by that point?
This is the Peter Zeihan question. I am pretty confident. I am. It's interesting. So this is challenging for me because I come from a traditional place of the United States runs everything, and the United States is going to continue to run everything. But it's becoming clearer and clearer to me as I make my way through 12 solid years of utterly incompetent, warmongering, idiot presidents that the chances of the United States continuing to screw up its incredible lead on everything are very, very high.
Because I remember the old worst case scenario was a Bush-like, but I feel like two Trumps that are staggered has been significantly worse than any Bush.
Not yet, but it has the potential to be significantly worse than any Bush, because Bush really set a horrifically bad trajectory. But yeah, just the idea of basic dignity and consistency, those ideas of basic dignity and consistency, Trump has been throwing out are more valuable than I think we know.
Would you like a list of countries that got their independence in the 40s?
Well, sure.
Lebanon, 1943 from France.
Lebanon has never. Okay, well, we can. Lebanon has never been an independent country. Anyway, moving on.
Okay. Syria, 1946 from France.
Yeah, it's pretty dubious.
Jordan, 1946 from the UK.
Yeah, no way. Like, I think they still had British guys running their military up until. And is Jordan an independent country from the United States today? I would say absolutely not.
India, 1947 from the UK.
That's like a real independent country.
Yeah.
Pakistan,
1947 from the UK.
That is like a. Which patron is more important to Pakistan at this point? I guess they're independent to the extent that nobody really knows whether they're a U.S. patron or a Chinese patron. So I guess,
Yeah,
it's a big country. We can call them kind of independent. Yeah.
Burma/Myanmar, 1948 from the UK.
As we've covered before, that is, actually, you can make a solid argument that Myanmar is a sovereign, independent country. However, you can also make solid elements that, like, 25% of its land area is also independent from Myanmar. So it's a mess. But anyway, yeah.
Sri Lanka, 1948 from the UK.
I'm confident saying that is an independent country, but not a particularly well-run one.
Israel, 1948 from the British Maastricht Treaty.
Yeah, moving on.
Laos from France, 1949.
Oof, Laos is a grim story.
And Vietnam, 1945 from
So
France.
that is all of the country, and Vietnam 1945 for France, except France ended up fighting until 1954 and Yemen. Yeah, so those are all of the countries that were liberated in the 1940s.
Yeah, and a lot of them are India or India adjacent. Editing Ruri here. We missed out Indonesia. The independent movement started in 1945 and it was officially handed over by the Dutch in 1949. So that's another very important one we missed out.
Exactly. That nicely underlines that there was not a great independence wave. But I think, and this was something that struck me, is that by the 1950s, China was capable of going toe-to-toe with the United States in the 1950s. That's with heavy Soviet support, of course, in the Korean War, and that's kind of extraordinary. India did not directly face U.S. soldiers the way that China did, but by the 1970s, India was using its own military force to thwart U.S. agendas in its neighborhood by fostering the liberation of Bangladesh. That's like, those are big moves that I don't think, many other countries have been able to pull off at any point in the past 80 years. So to go to your earlier question, are these countries going to split up in some way? I suppose anything's possible, but
because the big thing would be like China's population decline seems to be staggering, which could be terrible, but as Japan has shown, might just be kind of fine and you kind of stagnate.
I think the important thing with demographics is that they can change. The overarching concern of every thinking person from like the 1960s to the 2010s was overpopulation. All of a sudden it's underpopulation. I'm not saying they were wrong to be concerned about overpopulation in the 1960s or that we are wrong to be concerned about underpopulation in the 2020s. But I think that these things can change, AI, automation. I think, like, speaking as a guy in his 30s and 40s who has a lot of female friends in their 30s and 40s, like, the way that, like, the science of reproduction has moved forward.
Well, recently there was we're getting the first humans with 3 people's DNA.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that there are the chances of the horrors of childbirth being dramatically alleviated in some way in the coming decades, I'd say are, I wouldn't count it out. I feel like China and India specifically are countries that are on sort of leading edges of innovation, and I think that they might find ways around the demographics problem. They might not, but like I think just looking at the trajectory of these two massive countries, like it's what, like an eighth plus, more than an eighth of the world population lives in each of these countries.
Oh yeah, do you ever see
Um,
that thing where it's like inside this circle is like half of the world's population, and it's kind of just around India and China?
yeah, yeah. But specifically India and China, because of their size, because of their continental scale, can't really be pushed around
Oh
by
no,
the
no, no.
United States the way any other country in the world can.
Because India has always been weirdly sort of not neutral, but you know what I mean. It's always been kind of on India's side, and sometimes it looks like it's working with America, and sometimes it looks like it's working with China, but it's always doing what India wants.
So of the famous countries in the middle of the 20th century that started the non-aligned movement, the big leaders were Nehru of India, Tito of Yugoslavia, and Nasser of Egypt.
It's a great tactic for Tropico if you've ever played it.
Is that a video game of some
Yeah, it's
sort,
kind of
or?
like a fictional Cuba. So quite
Mhm.
often you're forced to either choose the Soviets or the Americans, but a good tactic is to stay neutral
Huh,
and
interesting.
just do the bare minimum to keep both happy.
Interesting. So of the non-aligned countries, Egypt, India, and Yugoslavia, I mean, I think Indonesia also played a role, but of the big ones, Egypt is a completely humiliated basket case, a client state of the United States. Yugoslavia is gone, like gone, gone, gone. And India's just there because India had the weight to truly go its own way. Even today, we're seeing examples of that where most other countries have been bullied out of buying oil and gas from Russia. And India was like, nope, we're going to keep doing that. And both the Biden and the Trump administrations have been like, I guess you're going to keep doing that. Lindsey Graham, nightmare warmonger senators, really pushing the idea of finally sanctioning India for buying oil and gas from Russia. But I don't think anybody thinks that's actually getting through. Yeah, India is big enough that it can just sort of do its own thing.
Like an Indian elephant.
And China, as a communist country, yes, is also just sort of doing its own thing. And I think my general estimation of US power, I actually think there's like a third power that could be emerging right now that could have establish a kind of equilibrium, a sort of like tripolar world for decades or possibly centuries to come, and that would be the United States. So I do think that the United States has, if we can, fix our immigration engine, has the possibility to sort of compete on the level of a China or an India civilizational state. And this is actually, I mean, this is a huge shift
I
in
would say an
human
argument
history.
for that is, quite often we're looking at history, but America didn't exist in the way it does currently in the historical context. So it is very likely America could stay around for 500 years.
Exactly, and the weirdness of the way that, I mean, it has taken millennia of savage conquest and being conquered and churn and famine and destruction to set up China and India as they are today as continental, powers with a progressively more and more unified population. The incredible blessing of the United States was smallpox that did that for us in the
Hmm.
space of a couple hundred years. That wiped out the people who used to live here, and then, of course, there were ancillary massacres and genocides thereafter. But it was really just the fact that the base population had died through disease, and there was this constant fire hose of people that we really shouldn't be stopping in the United States. And if the United
But
States
you got to keep those labor camps going, Rob.
Fair enough, fair enough. If the United States were to, finally sort out its immigration engine, which is still functioning to a degree, I think that we could talk about 100, 200 years from now, we could really, I don't know, how did George Orwell put it? But, you have North America, the Indian subcontinent, and China as sort of like the three main factors in the world. It'd be nice if the EU could, get its stuff together. It'd be nice if the African Union could get itself together. It'd be nice if Latin America could get its stuff together. And all of these things are possible. But I think the possibility of an emerging world where in the coming centuries, where it is the United States versus India versus China. Now, I don't mean in like a military, like
Oh,
full
yeah,
on
yeah, yeah.
Orwellian, but
Just as in
competition.
cooperating on a planet.
Yeah, I
Because
think
the
that
populations could possibly be similar at that point. Because if China does decline to say 800 million, America's
Mhm.
could be that much in 100 years.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, no question. 100 years, 800 million, maybe 200 years. But in 200 years' time, of course, in 200 years' time, what's a human being gonna be? But, no, I mean, it's a legitimate
Oh, yeah,
question.
it is. Because
Yeah,
it just out of just a website I usually buy computer parts from, I was just looking at what they had in AI, and I could just buy a robot for $100,000 or sterling. So it was just like, oh, I can just get them now.
yeah, it's
It's
crazy.
expensive, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And the sort of hybridization between robots and
Oh, yeah,
humans,
yeah.
and
And I
I
think
mean,
the
the
very
extent.
first, like, a completely artificial heart, Australian, outfit has made it. It seems you don't have a heartbeat, it just sort of spins, and it worked for 100 days until there was a donor heart came available, so, yeah,
Huh, I'll be
incredible
damned.
stuff.
Yeah, but yeah, so I mean, just the extent to which cell phones have changed everything is, and the United States still has. So I think what's changing for me, Rory, is that my model of the world going forward was it's probably going to be some variety of U.S. hegemony with that becomes progressively more benign and steps back more and more. The past 25 years have been rather disillusioning. I think the United States is going to continue as the main power for the rest of our lifetimes. But the just absolute idiocy with which we've been running things since at least 2001 indicates to me that the United States is not, in fact, going to go quietly into that night. And we actually need, or at least we're going to end up with something that's a little more contentious.
Do you think America will get a Suez crisis moment?
Uh, I think Suez comes after a bunch of other things. I think
Hmm.
Suez crisis for Britain was tremendously humiliating when the United States basically told Britain, actually, after Britain had worked with France and Israel to conquer Egypt, the United States says, yeah, no, you can't do that. Stop it and go home. And the British had no choice but to do that. I think that the United States could get to a Suez moment, but what's very likely before that is a bankrupting war, the way that World Wars I and II bankrupted the British Empire that put them into such a weak position. I mean, who's to say how things evolve? It depends on where we stick our nose, Rory. I think we've demonstrated, honestly, to me, kind of a disturbing durability. We are currently running a massive war against Russia and a massive war against everybody in the Middle East through Israel, with honestly kind of surprisingly few consequences for the United States. I mean, it's clear in worldwide polls that everybody in the world hates us. China is now, for the first time, more popular than the United States
Wow.
because of the Gaza. I mean, well deserved. Our
Yeah.
main export is dead children in Gaza. There are consequences. Our budget is like a weird fantasy thing, and we are the our repression is coming home with secret police and Gestapo and masked people running around our streets. With surprisingly few like direct consequences. If we were stupid enough to try to defend Taiwan against China, or I don't know, like what's a similar,
Well, the cartels thing seems horrific because it's on your doorstep.
well, that's very stupid. And thankfully,
This is the idea that America would go to war with Mexico, sort of a proxy to kill their cartels and stuff.
well, that would be very stupid. But I think in as that got worse and worse, it would get worse and worse for Mexico. I think
Hmm.
that if we were to actually go to war against the cartels, I think it could potentially produce like the end of US democracy for a while, but, at the end game of that is we'd probably conquer more of Mexico.
Mhm.
But, no, like Taiwan would really be a not a Suez moment, but like a,
But if you feel to do you feel like you would feel to defend Taiwan?
Of course, there's no question. We've utterly incapable. And that's what's sort of distinct about India and China. Like, we can, at tremendous cost to ourselves, our reputation, our dignity, pretty much invade and start a war over any part of the world right now, except for China and India. I feel like if we chose an island off of India, well, at this point with our U.S. Navy, we could probably still take an island off of India. But if we chose to, like, invade Tamil Nadu or something like that, we would get humiliated the same way we would if we decided to defend Taiwan. And that is why sort of China and India are distinct. I want to go back to your very valid question about, like, ooh, are these places going to disintegrate? And I really don't think so. The power of nationalism is extraordinary.
And through
And
modern technology, because Indians seem to be
exactly.
quite prolific. If they get a certain topic on board, you'll just suddenly see a lot of Indians supporting it. They seem to support Israel a lot as well, you'll see. And, when,
It's a very weird one that.
it is, but when they get
Yep.
something on
Mhm.
their mind, and sadly, I heard this was
Mhm.
like I don't know whether this was a rumor, but like you can
Mhm.
only have like WhatsApp groups so big because Indians would often get really wound up and spread rumors and then do like
Mhm.
pilgrims against Muslims. So sadly, it can supercharge nationalism.
Mhm. Well, yeah, and I think that that's a lot of the Peter Zeihan critique of China is like, well, if you look at Chinese history, like half the time or most of the time, which I think is actually a
But also, quite a
misinterpretation
lot
of
of
Chinese
his
history.
lately seems to be like, oh, they're only using this much oil and this much gas. And you're like, yeah, that's because they're trying to move to
Yeah.
renewables.
Yeah. Oh, I hadn't actually looked at his stuff recently. Is he complaining that they're
It
not
is,
using enough oil and
yeah,
gas?
it seems to be. It is obviously a thing that makes sense, but yeah, their whole point is, yeah, we don't want to rely on the rest of the world for our
Jesus.
energy.
Yeah, because Peter Zeihan, first and foremost, works for oil and gas
Hmm.
companies and does not quite understand the
Well,
possibilities
I
of
think yeah, that
renewables.
was his original like job in his early days, so he still has that mindset. Which there is credibility to it, but it isn't always 100% accurate in today's world.
But I think Peter Zeihan's case that China is going to fall apart is, I would argue, a misreading or too strong in one direction reading of Chinese history, arguing, oh, well, it always divides. Like, up until 1949, the vast majority of China's public was not literate, like, did not know how to read.
Because
Like,
was it not like one of the fastest like industrializations and like the scale of which they help people's lives was the fastest in like human history?
absolutely, and the baseline of that, even before, Deng's opening up, was the mass education of the Chinese people, and they were educated in a totalitarian, communist state that, put forward a bunch of communist ideas that are not proving to last very long, but also loyalty to this Chinese state. Like, no, in the history of Chinese dynasties, you had small elites in cities reading and talking and trading with other elites in small cities and lording it over 90% of the population that was illiterate peasants. Now you have 90% of the population is bought into the idea of Chinese nationalism and China existing as a country. And I do not doubt that China potentially has large crises to come in the coming decades, though I think there many are now arguing that actually this Chinese real estate collapse seems to be deflating in a much more orderly way than people thought. And actually, when they went after their tech companies, they seem to have kind of improved them.
Well, because I heard they shifted a lot of the money out of real estate and moved it into technology. So the I don't know whether it's true or not, but it's the rumor that's going around, which is they're graduating as many STEM people as America has in total a year, if that makes sense. So they're just like hammering out people of engineering and scientific degrees.
I think there's 2 or 3 or 15 sides to every one of those data points
Oh yeah,
you
yeah,
brought
yeah.
up. Yeah, but, I think it is undeniable that I think China is very, very light. It's not undeniable, but I think China's very likely to stay together.
And also when you consider the
Mhm.
Qing dynasty lasted from what's the 1600s, so that's at least another couple of hundred years. the Chinese Communist Party has.
Well, I think that the Chinese Communist Party is infinitely more powerful than any Chinese dynasty we've seen just through.
Wow, that is a terrifying thing to say if you consider world history.
Not really. But I mean, I think that Ireland has an infinitely more powerful government than it's ever had.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. But to say that the government, because when you consider those were quite often some of the most strongest armies and countries on earth through a lot of world history, to then just go, oh, yeah, and China's now infinitely more powerful than that.
Well, but also Mongolia is infinitely more
Okay.
powerful than it. Well, okay. Maybe Mongolia is an exception.
Yes.
Yeah, they are not quite Genghis Khan, but the territory of Mongolia as a literate territory with a conception of nationalism, every country in the world is infinitely more powerful than it ever was at any point in human history. And there's like 200 of them now, which is crazy, like so many more. And like even the Congo, probably one of the most beset upon and unsuccessful states of the modern era, there is some sense of themselves as Congolese and a soccer team to root for, sorry, football team to root for, and this, that, and the other thing. And all of that is so much more powerful than any Chinese dynasty. And the
Hmm.
Chinese government today has got the internet, it has got television, it has got a literate public, it has got, so even if there,
Drone swarms.
it's got drone swarms. So even if there are a series of crises to come, which is very likely, and I think the United States certainly has some crises to come as well, it is a durable polity that will survive that. I think India is a lot more fraught. Like India has it's more of an open question.
But is that not also an advantage because it's got so many more cultures, it'll sort of be able to flex and bend. While if something major happens to CCP, China could be in serious trouble. It's a bit like like when you want to have if you want to make a forest, it's better to have like lots of different trees. So if a disease affects it, it only affects one region. While if it's a monoculture, they all get wiped out by the one disease. Does China have that issue where one issue could wipe it out, while India is a lot more free and disparate and
I think that way of looking at it is heartening and, nicely multicultural, and I think there's some elements of real truth to it. But I think if the Chinese Communist government falls, I think that in 5 years' time, it's very likely that there will be a newly unified, Chinese government. Or maybe it's in 50 years' time. It took 100 years the last time. But what emerged after, the century of humiliation, between, say, the Second Opium War and, the communists taking over
which
1949.
apparently wasn't that much about opium.
What's that?
Apparently, the
Eh, it
Second
was
Opium War, it was like it took a back seat this time. It wasn't the main star.
well, it was about conquering China
No, yeah,
fundamentally.
trading with China is
That's
the
what it
term
did.
you'll hear.
But as the Chinese Communist Party was infinitely more powerful than the imperial thing that was sort of destroyed in the Second Opium War, I think that whatever would reemerge after, the fall of the communists is likely to be even more powerful than that. Whereas in India, if the government were to fall at this point, I do think there's a higher danger of fragmentation because of just the diversity of India. However, I think that even in those diverse parts of India, there's a great commitment to being not conquered. I think the average Indian sort of sub-nationalist, someone who's invested in another identity rather than Indian nationality, at this point would make sort of the common sense judgment that, well, sure, I care a lot more about, I don't know, my Telugu nationality, but I'm probably safer with this Indian nationality than I would be if I were to try to go it alone, like all those little European countries who, have to get stuck in the US's wars or whatever. So, yeah, but I think I just think I don't know if I'm being too vague here, but I think it is an interesting way of conceptualizing the future is it's kind of, America versus India versus China.
So does this mean you're now 100% behind BRICS?
No, no, that is not the estimation because in fact, if the United States got its stuff together and started operating in a more rational way, stopped doing genocides in the middle of nowhere, it should be child's play to turn India and China against each other. It's not hard. Like that's the most optimistic. That's the most optimistic thing for U.S. power going
Oh God,
forward
that's
is
horrific.
is that no, I mean we don't have to. I'm not saying we have to foster World War III between the two of them. I'm just saying we just have to, like let's help Pakistan arm up a little bit more and make it look like the Chinese are doing it because the Chinese are doing it. Like it's not difficult to induce a higher level of stress and play them off of each other. It's only difficult when we're actively fighting two wars in regions that frankly don't matter like at all. Like Europe and the Middle East are backwaters and they are becoming bigger they are becoming lesser backwaters with every year. And if the United States was sane, we would abandon, Europe and the Middle East to whatever they want to do and get down to the more serious, important business of playing India and China off of each other. That's where the future is. That's what matters going forward. And what we should do is, no, we don't, I mean, I want to like put it that pejoratively. We should work to be friends with distant friends to everybody in Europe, including Russia, and the Middle East, including Iran, and focus much more of our effort and money on buttering up the countries around India and China so as to use those countries to better play China and India off of each other. That is the future of U.S. foreign policy. That is what we should be doing. But that's not what we're doing.
But there does seem to be like China does seem to be putting a lot more infrastructure on the Indian border. There's a new dam going in that could steal a lot of water from India or turn off the tap. And India is desperately trying to sort of match it, but it just doesn't have the sort of the financial backing to do so. Do you see this sort of happening anyway, even if America sort of does something stupid?
An infinitely better use of, I don't know, $500 billion than CENTCOM for the next 5 years. This is our crappy little luxury good we use to piss about in the Middle East. That's, I'm sure, going to cost us $500 billion over the next 10 years anyway. An infinitely better use of that funding would be to help India build up that hydroelectric infrastructure in the north of India. I think a key part of this is that, like, I mean, China and India are different countries. China and India have very different growth prospects and track records at this point. So for the next couple decades, and this is something I think the United States isn't doing too bad a job of actually at this point, but could be doing a much better job. For the next couple decades, our main priority is getting India up to speed, helping India build the infrastructure it needs, helping India build the relationships in international business that it needs, and just helping India. But then a point would come in 10 to 20 years, demographics have caught up with China, the Indian economy has really rampaged up. There would come a point where maybe we should work harder to rebuild relationships with China. Like
Hmm.
that's the kind of baseline Machiavellian stuff that we should be doing right now instead of figuring out how to genocide more brown people in Gaza. This is the foreign policy for the United States for the next centuries. And it's a bit frustrating to me that we are not doing that. We're
Could you
not
just see
focusing
the
on that
big
at
three
all.
teaming up and just destroying the rest of the world?
Could I see the big three teaming up and destroying the rest of the world? Yes, 100%.
Lovely.
But I don't think it's interesting. It's in the interest of a tripolar world to do that because there are a lot of consumers in Europe, in Africa, a lot of people to do business with, a lot of people who control a lot of resources. And it's actually better for all great powers to live in the kind of world that the United States set up over the course of the 20th century outside of our sacrifice regions. So sort of Southeast Asia was a sacrifice region from the 1950s into the 1970s. And then the Middle East became sort of a sacrifice region to the military-industrial complex from the 1980s through to today. But outside of those sort of sacrifice regions, generally the United States sought to set up a peaceful environment where everybody could do business. That's actually like, unless the United States continues on its path to being an idiot country that does nothing other than build bombs, and like, have a couple tech oligarchs that are mostly just competing to work for the government to build bombs, or sorry, AI bombs or whatever. It actually is in the interest of these three major countries to have a peaceful world order in which we can compete and trade and, cultivate the stars or whatever. Current U.S. leadership is not interested in that. I think a U.S. leadership that actually has a better sense of what it should be doing over the coming centuries, which is playing China off of India, would be more interested in preserving the elements of a peaceful world order, something like the free exchange of goods. Not as free exchange of goods as it was when we were unimpeachably on top, but, at least the possibility of a free exchange of goods without your ship getting sunk by the Houthis because you're carrying out a genocide in Gaza,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So, yeah, I don't know. I feel like I don't know if I've communicated so well what I meant to say today, but I think that China and India are a lot more important than most of my work indicates, but certainly most of the discussion in foreign policy arenas in the United States indicates.
What has India done recently that's impressed you?
Well, India, I don't know if it's impressive so much as it's kind of troubling, but it is definitely a success. The United States has retained a lot of hegemonic power over the past 10 years, despite losing leadership to China on a wide array of industrial metrics for one weird talent that is troubling, but is important, which is we're better for rich people than anybody else. Meaning we have a certain sort of Anglo-Saxon, for lack of a better term, way of organizing our capital markets, our stock markets, debt markets. Shareholder value is the primacy, which basically means doing well for rich investors. So despite the fact that China has the world-beating most best electric car company, BYD, Tesla is still worth a lot more in market capitalization because it's run by a delusional but very, very talented marketing individual that has demonstrated, and now Tesla is, of course, a far, far outlier, but if you look at practices like share buybacks, the U.S. companies have had some of their most profitable years ever. And they mostly use that money to buy some of their shares back so that their investors do well out of it. Like that culture, that primacy of the investor is something that is present nowhere else in the world except for weirdly India. And I think India's capital markets, I have been invested in emerging markets for 20 years right now. And generally speaking, I've lost big with my investments in emerging markets, except for India. And it's not that India has been doing a better job industrially or commercially than China is. They absolutely have not, but they care more about their investors than they do in China. So I've done better, like my ETFs.
Is it because they have had quite an Anglo-Saxon influence as
I
well?
think there's some of that. Despite the decades of socialism intervening, maybe it's just the English language and the fact that I think most elites in India, at least, are fluent in the English language, probably more fluent in the English language than most American elites.
Hey,
Certainly the last couple presidents anyway.
Technically, there's probably more speakers.
And probably, educated to a higher standard than certainly our recent U.S. presidents, with the exception of Obama.
Well, he's going to jail soon anyway.
Yeah, sure. That's
I seen a
definitely gonna
video
happen.
of it.
Oh, well, yeah. Was it AI or whatever?
It might have been AI.
You imagine that. Imagine that. But India, I'm not sure if it's a good thing, this emphasis on shareholder value above all else, but it seems like India has sort of figured that out, and the ability to access capital in that way, as Tesla proves, it's amazing if you can just sort of
hoodwink them long enough.
Convince people to if you can convince people to invest with you enough,
because I've seen
you can actually build the world-beating car company that Tesla kind of is, or was.
Yeah, was. Its sales are going
Yeah.
downhill, and it's trying to be a robot company now, but its robots are a bit underpowered. But China seems to be overtaken by robots lately.
China's overtaken by robots?
I keep saying Chinese robots everywhere. They had a Chinese robot Olympics. There was robots fighting. They were playing football. It was all very futuristic.
Yeah, I think tech. It's absurd to me that we cosset these oligarch tech billionaires in the United States to the extent that we do, as they're getting their lunch eaten for them by the Chinese. They're all super focused on AI, which I think the consensus anyway is that DeepSeek was not as impressive. The Chinese AI was not as impressive an accomplishment as many said. But what it pointed to, so the reason that DeepSeek isn't that impressive is because it was always entirely built on American AI technology. It's like, okay, but like, what about AI technology isn't replicable? Like that actually, it's like, so, okay, so we're putting all of these trillions of dollars of investment into building, these new AI solutions. We're going to win AI. And then some Chinese, hedge fund is going to be able to replicate it. And who cares,
But do the Chinese have Mecha Hitler?
That's true. That's true. They have fewer AIs with a passion for Hitler.
Hmm.
So
And white
yay.
genocide.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that the United States, if it were run by sensible people, would be a very capable competitor, or even leading competitor, to China and India for centuries to come. We need to make a few
Meddle
changes
more.
first, huh?
You need to meddle more with India and China and forget about everyone else.
Metal is such a pejorative term, Rory, but
Help your Indian friends
help our Indian friends until
until
it's time
they're
to help our
Chinese friends.
Chinese friends. Yeah,
Okay.
it's all very sensible, all very sensible. Though obviously we need to rebuild the capacity to actually help anybody in industrial capacity in the United States as well. But yeah, so sort of big picture historical thoughts that have been bothering me as I'm writing this book of American history and realizing that, in fact, World War II is not as important as Chinese and Indian independence, and the Cold War it's not about the U.S. and the Soviets. It's about the U.S. continually finding itself on the wrong side of independence struggles, and that's the beauty of writing, Rory, is that it becomes a mind opening procedure.
Well, on that potentially optimistic note, where the world is now split into three and they seem to be peaceful and just trade, hopefully they'll listen to this in the future and see that's where it all started from.
Yeah, I'm
The,
here, happy to lead the way,
the
Rory.
first
Happy to lead the
podcast that
way.
was right about the future.
The tripolar furry future, indeed.
We'll catch you next time.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.